The first time Fannie Slater saw the man who would change everything, he was standing at her front door with his hat in his hands and a look on his face like he was about to deliver very bad news. It was the autumn of 1878, and the town of Millhaven, Texas, sat baked and golden beneath an October sun that refused to apologize for the heat it still carried. Millhaven was not a grand town by any measure. It had one church with a crooked steeple, two saloons that competed loudly for the same customers every Saturday night, a general store run by a man named Horace Prout, who smelled perpetually of tobacco and pickled beets, and a single dusty main street that turned to thick red mud whenever the rains came down hard from the north. But it was home to Fannie Slater, and she had long since stopped apologizing for loving it. Fannie was 26 years old, dark-haired, and possessed of sharp brown eyes that missed very little. She had come to Millhaven 3 years prior with her husband Thomas, who had believed with the iron certainty of a young man that he could make a cattle operation work on the flat, sun-hardened land just south of town. Thomas had been handsome and determined and utterly wrong. The cattle got sick first, then the money ran out, and then Thomas himself got sick in the spring of 1877 with a fever that the town's one physician could not chase away. He was buried in June of that year on a hill behind the church, under a wooden cross that Fannie had painted white herself, because she thought it looked more like hope than raw timber did. What Thomas left behind besides a grave and a memory was a rented house on the eastern edge of Millhaven, a box of debts that Fannie sorted through at the kitchen table one February evening with a candle burning low, and a daughter named Rose who had her father's stubborn jaw and her mother's dark eyes, and was 4 years old and entirely unaware that the world was difficult. Fannie also had a sewing kit, a steady hand, and the kind of pride that made a woman work her fingers raw before she would ask a neighbor for a cup of sugar. She had been surviving. That was the honest word for it. Not thriving, not flourishing, but surviving with a determined stubbornness that she wore like armor. She took in mending and alterations for the women of Millhaven. She baked pies for the saloon on weekends. She grew a small garden behind the rented house and canned everything she could before winter. The rent on the house was $8 a month, collected by a man named Gerald Holt who owned 3 properties in Millhaven and lived in a big house on the north side of town with a wife who wore too much perfume and a permanent expression of mild disdain. Gerald Holt was not cruel, exactly. He was the particular kind of man who simply never thought about anyone else long enough to develop cruelty into a proper skill. He knew Fannie was a widow. He knew she had a child. He knew she was working herself to near exhaustion to keep the rent paid each month. None of this moved him to any particular softness. He wanted his $8 on the first of every month, and he sent someone to collect it because he himself did not enjoy such errands. That someone, for the past 4 months, had been a cowboy named Levi Granger. And that was who was standing at Fannie Slater's front door on that October morning, hat in his hands, looking like a man who was carrying something heavier than he was letting on. Levi Granger was 31 years old, which Fannie would not learn for some time, and he stood 2 inches over 6 feet in boots that were worn at the heels and honest about it. He was lean in the way that men who worked cattle were lean, with broad shoulders and hands that were calloused and capable. His hair was dark brown, shading toward black, and he kept it cut short on the sides in the way that suggested he did not give his appearance much thought but also managed not to look unkempt. His jaw carried the kind of stubble that was just past deliberate and not quite into careless. His eyes were gray, which surprised Fannie the first time she looked directly into them, because gray eyes were uncommon in Millhaven, where most people looked at you with brown or green or the occasional washed-out blue. He had first appeared at her door in July, a month after Thomas's grave had settled into the earth, sent by Gerald Holt to collect the rent. He had been polite then, respectful. He had taken the $8 she pressed into his hand, given her a receipt written in Gerald Holt's cramped script, touched the brim of his hat, and left without making her feel small about the transaction. She had noticed that. A woman in her position noticed such things. He had come back in August and again in September, and now here he was in October, hat in his hands, and this time the expression on his face was different from the businesslike neutrality of the previous months. "Mrs. Slater," he said. "Mr. Granger." She wiped her hands on her apron because she had been at the door and hadn't heard him ride up. "I have the rent. One moment." "Ma'am," he shifted his weight. "There's no hurry." She went to the small tin box she kept on the second shelf of the kitchen cupboard and counted out $8. She was aware, as she counted, that this left her with very little until the next pie order came in from the saloon. She was also aware that she was not going to let Levi Granger or anyone else see her count that carefully. She came back to the door with the money and held it out. He took it from her with a brief nod, and their fingers did not quite touch, and she noticed that too, in the way she noticed everything. "How is your daughter?" he asked. She was mildly surprised. "She's well. She's at Mrs. Alderman's this morning learning her letters." "Good," he said. He looked past her into the dim interior of the house, not in a presumptuous way, but in the way a man looks at something when he is thinking about it. "You fixed that shutter," he observed. She looked at the window to the left of the door. The shutter had been hanging at an angle for weeks. She had repaired it herself with a piece of leather and a nail she'd pulled from the fence post out back. "I did," she said. He nodded again, and something passed across his face that she could not entirely read. "You're a capable woman, Mrs. Slater." It was not a flattering remark the way some men made flattering remarks, as though offering her a compliment was meant to purchase some warmth from her. He said it simply, in the way a person states a fact they have observed and found worth acknowledging. She found she did not know what to do with it, so she said nothing. He put his hat back on, tucked the receipt form into his shirt pocket, and said good morning, and then he rode back down the road toward town on a horse so dark it was nearly black, and Fannie stood in the doorway and watched him go for slightly longer than was necessary. She told herself it was because she was trying to see if the wheel on the gatepost had come loose again. It had not. The gatepost was fine. She went back inside and kneaded her dough. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon in late October when the light fell long and amber across the floor, Fannie was mending a dress for Margaret Alderman when she heard a knock at the door that was different from Levi Granger's knock, which she had by now catalogued, unconsciously, as 3 firm taps. This knock was 2 hard bangs, which meant Gerald Holt himself. She smoothed her hair and opened the door. Gerald Holt was a wide man with a red face and the beginnings of jowls that would probably be impressive in another decade. He wore a waistcoat that had been expensive once. He stood on her porch with his thumbs in his pockets and a look on his face that she recognized as the expression men wore when they were about to tell you something unpleasant that they were framing as helpful. "Mrs. Slater," he said. "Mr. Holt. I'll be direct with you. I'm raising the rent on this property to $12 a month starting the 1st of December. Fannie kept her face entirely still. This was a skill she had developed in the years since Thomas died, this ability to absorb a blow without letting it show until she was alone. "That is a considerable increase," she said. "It's a fair market rate," he said, in the tone of a man who had decided something was true and was not interested in any evidence to the contrary. "The property has been improved, new well cover, fixed fence line." She did not point out that she had fixed the fence line herself, using wire she traded 2 pies for. She just said, "I see. You'll let me know by end of November whether you can manage it," he said. "Otherwise I'll need to find another tenant for January." And then he put his hat back on and walked back to his horse and rode away, and Fannie closed the door and stood in the middle of her kitchen for a long time. $12 a month. She ran the numbers the way she always ran numbers now, quickly, and without hope of finding a better answer than the one she already knew was there. Her mending and alterations brought in perhaps $5 or $6 in a good month. The pies brought in $2. The garden was nearly done for the season. $12 left almost nothing for food, for lamp oil, for Rose's shoes that were already tight across the toes, for the endless small necessities of keeping a child alive and a household running. She sat down at the kitchen table, and she put her hands flat on the surface, and she breathed slowly. And she did not cry because crying was a luxury she generally saved for after Rose was asleep. She would find a way. She always found a way. She just could not currently see what way that was. November came in cold and hard, the kind of Texas cold that surprised people who imagined the state was always warm. Fannie took on more mending. She offered to help Horace Prout at the general store on his busy days in exchange for a small wage. She sold 2 jars of canned peaches and one of pickled beets to Mrs. Alderman. She sat at her table by lamplight long after Rose was sleeping, and she calculated and recalculated and came up with the same answer every time, which was that $12 was going to be very tight and would require something to give somewhere. On the 1st of November, Levi Granger came to collect the rent as usual, but the rent was still $8 in November because December was when the increase would begin. She paid it and he took it, and she expected him to go, but he stood on the porch for a moment longer than usual. "Mr. Holt told you about the increase," he said. "It was not a question." "He did." Levi's jaw tightened. It was a small movement, but she caught it. "I'm sorry about that, Mrs. Slater." "It's not your doing," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes. "No," he agreed. "It's not." But he said it in a way that suggested he felt it was somehow his responsibility anyway, which she did not understand. "I'll manage," she said, because that was what she always said, because it was always either true or she made it true eventually. "I don't doubt it," he said, and touched his hat and went. She stood at the window and watched him ride away again. This was becoming a habit she had not intentionally formed. Rose appeared at her elbow, clutching a cloth doll that had seen better days. "Who's that man, Mama?" "Someone who works for the man who owns this house," Fannie said. "He has a nice horse," Rose said. "He does," Fannie agreed, because the horse was genuinely beautiful. The next time she saw Levi Granger was not on a rent day. It was a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of November, and she was coming out of Horace Prout's general store with a small parcel under her arm when she nearly walked directly into him on the sidewalk. He caught her by the elbow to keep her from stumbling, and she felt the warmth of his hand through her sleeve and stepped back quickly. "Excuse me," she said. "My fault," he said immediately. "I should have watched where I was going." They stood on the sidewalk in the watery November sunshine and looked at each other for a moment, and it occurred to Fannie that outside of the context of rent collection, she had no particular social framework for this man. He was not a friend, not a neighbor, not a business acquaintance in any real sense. He was simply someone who knocked on her door once a month and who, she had begun to notice, had very kind eyes for someone whose expression was generally so reserved. "Are you shopping?" she asked because something had to be said. "Picking up feed," he said. "I work at the Barclay Ranch outside of town." She had known he was a working cowboy in a general sense but had not known the specifics. "The Barclay place, that's a fair ride from town." "About 4 miles," he said. He shifted the bag on his shoulder. "I ride in on my days off sometimes. Millhaven is a good enough town." "It is," she agreed, with more genuine warmth than she intended because she truly believed it. He smiled then, and it was the first time she had seen him smile, and it did something unexpected to her chest, which she immediately attributed to the cold air. They parted ways on the sidewalk, and she walked home with her parcel, and told herself firmly that she had too much practical business to attend to for her mind to be wandering in unnecessary directions. The end of November arrived with a cold north wind, and Fannie had $12 in her tin box, and the knowledge that this would leave her almost nothing for December. She had done everything she could think to do. She had taken on a new mending client, a rancher's wife outside of town who sent things in with her husband. She had sold 2 more jars of preserved goods. She had quietly eaten less than she wanted to for the past 3 weeks so that Rose would not notice any change in the household circumstances. On the 1st of December, she heard 3 firm taps at the door. She opened it to find Levi Granger with his hat in his hands and the gray eyes and the expression she had begun to recognize as his version of carefully controlled emotion. She handed him the $12. He looked at the money in his hand. Then he looked at her. And something happened in his face that she could not quite parse, some shifting of interior weather that he controlled before it became visible, but not quite quickly enough. "Thank you, Mrs. Slater," he said. "I expect a receipt for $12, she said, because Gerald Holt's cramped receipts were the only paperwork she had. "Of course." He wrote it out from the small book he carried, tore it along the perforated edge, and handed it to her. She looked at the receipt. It said $12, rent for December, the address of the property, and Gerald Holt's name printed across the top. Everything appeared to be in order. She was closing the door when he said, quietly, "Mrs. Slater." She stopped. "Yes." He seemed to be deciding something. He had his hat in his hands again, turning the brim, and she had noticed this was what he did when he was working through something internally. "The cold is setting in fast this year," he said, which was clearly not what he had started to say. "It is," she agreed. "The firewood on your side porch looked a bit thin last time I rode past." She had hoped no one had noticed that. "I'll be ordering more," she said, which was almost true. She was considering it strongly. He nodded. His jaw did the thing it did. "Good," he said. "Good night, Mrs. Slater." "Good night, Mr. Granger." She closed the door and put her back against it and let out a long breath. She did not order more firewood that week because when she sat with her numbers, she could not make them work that way. She would manage. She had blankets. She had the small cast iron stove in the kitchen that she kept burning low and steady, and she had learned how to bank the coals so they lasted through the night. What she did not know, and would not know for a long time yet, was what was happening on the other side of that transaction. Levi Granger had been working at the Barclay Ranch for 2 years. He was a reliable hand, quiet, competent, the kind of man that employers did not fire because such men were rare. He earned $28 a month plus board and meals, which was a decent wage for a ranch hand in 1878. He had been saving carefully because he had a vague, long-term idea of owning a small piece of land himself one day. The way men who work other people's land eventually begin to dream of their own. He had his savings in a bank account at the Millhaven Savings and Trust, which was a modest institution that occupied a narrow building between the barber shop and the harness maker on Main Street. He had started riding to Millhaven once a month to collect Gerald Holt's rents as a side arrangement. Holt paid him $1 per collection, which Levi had initially thought was an easy enough dollar for a day. He was already in town for other errands. There were 3 properties Holt rented out, but only Fannie Slater's caused him to ride away with a feeling he could not simply set aside by the time he got back to the ranch. The first time he'd seen her, she had been direct and composed and clearly proud, and he had recognized that pride immediately because it was the kind he understood, the pride of someone who was managing something difficult and had made an interior decision to manage it without asking for help. He had respected it. He had thought about it on the ride back to Barclays and then set it aside. The second time, he noticed the repaired window shutter and the carefully mended apron and the small hands that had clearly been working hard, and he began to do some quiet arithmetic of his own. By October, he knew roughly what she was bringing in and what she was spending, because a man who pays attention in a small town eventually assembles a picture from the pieces that float past him. He had seen her at Horace Prute's buying the minimum. He had seen the garden and known she was putting up what she could. He had heard, from the kind of casual overheard conversation that Millhaven produced abundantly, that the widow Slater was making do. And then Gerald Holt had told him he was raising the rent to $12, and Levi had stood in Holt's office on a cold November morning and felt something harden in his chest. He had not said anything dramatic. He was not a dramatic man. He had just thought about it for 4 days, turning it over the way he turned his hat brim when he was working something out. And at the end of 4 days he had arrived at a decision that was perhaps not entirely rational but felt, in the deepest part of him, like the only sensible thing. When Fannie Slater handed him $12 in December, he gave Gerald Holt $8 of it and put $4 of his own money on top and told Holt it was all 12. That was the first time. The second month he did it without deliberating at all. He simply made up the difference. The third month he did the same. He was paying Gerald Holt $12, but he was only taking 8 of that from Fannie Slater. He was covering the $4 difference from his own wages, from the savings he had been setting aside for the hypothetical land he might one day own. He did not think of it as charity. He did not exactly know what he thought of it as, and that was one of the things he turned over during his rides back to the Barclay Ranch. The long 4 miles in the cold evening air, the dark horse moving steadily beneath him, the stars beginning to show over the flat Texas land. He thought about a woman with dark eyes who fixed her own shutters and stretched her flower further than flower was meant to go and still managed to send her daughter to Mrs. Alderman's to learn her letters, because she believed in learning even when the money barely stretched to it. He thought about the way she had said, "I'll manage," with that particular quality of certainty that was not bravado, but was something older and quieter and more real. He thought about January and February and the long cold stretch before spring, and he kept paying the difference. He would have kept his secret indefinitely, except for what happened in March of 1879. March came in raw and wet, the kind of early spring that is not really spring at all but just winter with different precipitation. Fannie was at the general store on a Wednesday afternoon when she overheard a conversation that stopped her where she stood between the bolts of cloth and the box of thread. Horace Prout was talking to a man named Amos Birch who kept a small law office on the far end of Main Street, and they were not being particularly quiet, because neither of them had noticed Fannie standing behind the bolt of blue cotton on the far side of the shelf. $8, Prout said. Holt's getting 8 for it. Thought he raised it to 12, Birch said. He did. That's what I'm saying. The cowboy that does his collections, Granger, he told Holt he could only get 8 from the widow. Said the woman could barely manage and he didn't want to take more than she had. Holt took it. I don't think Holt fully thought about it. You know how Holt is. But I heard from Rena Holt herself that the full 12 keeps coming in every month like clockwork. A pause, the sound of something being said on a counter. So Granger's making up the difference himself, Birch said. That's what I figure, Prout said. Either that or he's robbing from the other collections, but Granger's not that kind. He's been putting it from his own pocket, is my guess. Fannie stood very still behind the bolt of blue cotton and felt the world rearrange itself slightly. She waited until the 2 men moved toward the front of the store, and then she put down the thread she had been intending to buy and walked out through the back and stood in the cold March air behind the store and tried to think. He had been paying her rent, not collecting it, paying the difference himself, from his own money, every single month, and she had been handing him $8 thinking it was 12, and feeling proud of herself for managing, and he had made up the rest without saying a word. She felt a number of things in rapid succession. First, a hot flush of something that might have been embarrassment, though she could not entirely decide what she was embarrassed about since she hadn't done anything wrong. Then something warmer and more complicated, a kind of bewildered gratitude that was so unexpected it made her feel unsteady. And then, quite quickly following that, something closer to anger, because she did not want to be someone's charity case. She had been very deliberate about not being a charity case. She walked home in the cold and put Rose to bed early and sat at the kitchen table with a lamp in her hands and her thoughts. She turned it over. She turned it over again. The thing was, she knew the difference between charity and something else. She had received charity after Thomas died. Mrs. Alderman had brought casseroles. The women of the church had left preserves on the porch. That was charity, offered openly and received with the social understanding that it was an act of community kindness. This was something different. This was a man quietly solving a problem on her behalf without her knowledge or permission, which was a kind of presumption, and she had every right to be annoyed by it. She sat with that righteous annoyance for a while and found, somewhat irritatingly, that it kept getting softer at the edges. Because the other thing she kept returning to was why. Why would a ranch hand she barely knew spend his own money to cover $4 of her rent every month? He had nothing to gain from it. She had not asked for it. He had not told her. There was no audience for the gesture, which meant it could not be about how it looked. That left only what it actually was, and she did not quite know what to do with that yet. She decided she was going to confront him. Quietly and directly, because that was how she did things. She did not have to wait until the 1st of April. On a Saturday afternoon, she saw his dark horse tied up outside the saloon, which surprised her because he did not strike her as a heavy drinker, and she went inside, which surprised the 3 men at the bar considerably, because women of Fannie's particular variety of respectability did not generally walk into Millhaven's saloon on a Saturday afternoon. He was at a corner table with a cup of coffee, which explained the saloon because the saloon also functioned as the only establishment in town that served coffee in the afternoon outside of private homes. He was reading a newspaper, or he had been, because he looked up when she came in and she watched the surprise move across his face. She sat down across from him without being invited. "Mrs. Slater," he said carefully. "Mr. Granger." She put her hands flat on the table, which was her habit when she needed to say something difficult. "I have heard something that I need to ask you about directly." He set down the newspaper. His expression settled into something that was neither guilty nor defensive, but was, she thought, the expression of a man who had known this conversation was going to arrive eventually and had been considering what to say. "All right," he said. "Mr. Holt raised the rent to $12 in December," she said. "I have been paying you what I believe to be the full $12. I have recently come to understand that you have been giving Mr. Holt only $8 and covering the difference yourself." She paused. "Is that true?" A beat. "Yes," he said, "just that." She had expected more. A denial maybe, or a complicated explanation. The simple yes caught her slightly off guard. "Why?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light came through the saloon's grimy window and fell across the table between them. "Because $4 is not a small thing for you, Mrs. Slater," he said, "and it wasn't a thing I couldn't manage." "That is not an answer to the question why," she said. He picked up the coffee cup and put it down without drinking. "No," he agreed. "I suppose it isn't." She waited. He looked out the window for a moment and then back at her. "I have watched you," he said, and then seemed to realize how that sounded and amended it quickly. "I mean, in the course of coming to your house each month, I have observed that you work very hard for what you have and that you don't ask for help and that you're raising your daughter alone and doing it well. And when Holt raised the rent, I thought it was not a fair thing to do to someone in your position." "There are many unfair things in the world," she said. "People do not generally pay for them out of their own savings." "No," he said, "they don't." "So I ask again," she said, and her voice was quieter now and had lost some of its controlled edge. "Why?" He looked at her with those gray eyes for a long enough time that the silence became its own kind of answer. "Because I wanted to," he said finally. "Because I could. Because it seemed like the right thing." He paused. "Because I think about you more than I probably should, considering that I barely know you." That was not what she had expected either. She felt the warmth move up into her face and was annoyed by it. "Mr. Granger," she said. "I know," he said quickly. "I'm sorry if that was forward. I'm not saying it to make you uncomfortable. I'm just saying it because you asked me directly and I don't know how to be anything other than direct back." She sat with that for a moment. The saloon's 3 occupants at the bar were studiously not looking at them, which meant they were absolutely looking at them. "I don't want your charity," she said. "I know," he said again. "It's not charity, or I didn't think of it that way. Charity is when you give someone something and they know about it. He stopped, turned his coffee cup. "I just wanted things to be easier for you, even a little." Fannie looked at him. She thought about the shutter she had fixed herself with a nail and a piece of leather. She thought about the flower she had stretched and the fires she had banked and the calculations she had run by lamplight when Rose was sleeping. She thought about being 26 years old with a child and a sewing kit and a very firm plan to manage. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "I should have. That was wrong of me. You had a right to know." "You took that right away from me," she said. "Yes," he said without arguing. "I did, and I'm sorry." She looked at him. He held her gaze steadily, which she found she respected. He did not look away or squirm or try to qualify his apology into something less than what it was. "I want to pay you back," she said. "Mrs. Slater." "I want to pay you back," she said again firmly. "Every dollar when I'm able. I don't know when that will be, but I intend to." He looked like he was going to argue and then seemed to decide against it. "All right," he said. She stood up. "Thank you, Mr. Granger," she said, which was a peculiar thing to say in the context of being annoyed at someone. But it came out anyway because she could not be annoyed enough to forget her manners. And also because underneath the annoyance she was aware of something else entirely. Something that hummed quietly in the place behind her ribs where she tried not to look too directly. She walked out of the saloon and past the 3 men at the bar who were suddenly deeply interested in their glasses. Levi watched her go and then sat back in his chair and let out a long breath. He had not planned on saying what he'd said, the part about thinking about her more than he probably should. He had planned on apologizing, explaining, accepting whatever anger she directed at him, and leaving it at that. But she had asked him directly, and he had answered directly, and now she knew a thing he had not entirely known himself until he said it aloud. He rode back to Barclays in the early dark and thought about gray skies and flowers stretched thin and dark eyes that did not miss a single thing. Fannie, for her part, mended 3 dresses that evening with a focused intensity that her needle probably did not require. April came, and with it, the first real warmth of spring. Millhaven put out cautious green along its fences and in the patches of ground where seeds had been waiting out the cold. Fannie put in her garden with Rose helping more than she hindered, patting seeds into the turned earth with small, serious hands. Things began to feel, if not exactly easier, then at least more possible. On a Tuesday afternoon in the first week of April, there was a knock at her door that was 3 firm taps. She opened it and there was Levi Granger, but it was not the first of the month and he was not carrying the receipt book. "Mr. Granger," she said, surprised. He was holding a crate. Inside the crate were 2 dozen eggs, a cut of cured ham wrapped in brown paper, a jar of honey, and what appeared to be a small sack of good coffee. "I was at Prute's," he said, "and I found myself overstocked." She looked at the crate, then at him. "You do not appear to me to be a man who becomes accidentally overstocked." The corner of his mouth moved. "No," he admitted. "But I also cannot bring these back to Barclays because the cook there takes it personally when people bring in outside provisions." She looked at the crate again. The eggs were very fresh. The ham smelled wonderful. The honey jar caught the light in a way that was frankly beautiful. "This is charity," she said. "This is neighborly provision," he said. "There's a difference. You live 4 miles outside of town. I am not your neighbor." "I am choosing to define that broadly," he said. Something was happening around her mouth that she was working to control. "Mr. Granger," she said, "I told you I would pay you back every dollar." "You did," he said, "and I have full confidence you will. This is a separate matter." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her with those gray eyes that were perfectly calm on the surface and had something else running underneath them, something patient and warm that she had begun to recognize as the thing that made him fundamentally different from most men she had known. "Come in, then," she said. "I was about to make coffee, and I see that you have brought some." He came in, ducking his head slightly though the doorway was tall enough, and set the crate on her kitchen table, and she made coffee on the iron stove while he stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands and looked at the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams and the row of canning jars and the small painting Rose had made on a piece of board that hung above the window. "Rose did that?" he asked, nodding at the painting. "She did," Fannie said. "She told me it was a horse, and then told me it was a flower, and then told me it was a mountain, so I believe it is whatever it needs to be." He laughed at that, a real laugh, not the polite version, and she liked the sound of it considerably more than she expected to. They sat at her kitchen table and drank coffee and talked for an hour and a half, which was considerably longer than she had planned, and she found that he was easy to talk to in the way that certain people are easy, where the conversation does not require the constant, careful management that social interaction usually demands. He talked about the Barclay Ranch, the cattle work, the way the land looked in different seasons. He talked about growing up in Tennessee and coming west at 18 because the land there felt finished to him, and he wanted something that was still being made. She talked about Boston, where she had been born, and the strangeness of arriving in Texas as a young married woman, and feeling, unexpectedly, that it fit her in some way she could not explain. Rose came home from Mrs. Alderman's in the middle of the afternoon and stopped in the kitchen doorway when she saw the man at the table. "This is Mr. Granger," Fannie said. "He brought us eggs." Rose considered him with the direct assessment of a 5-year-old. "Do you have a horse?" she said. "I do," he said. "Is it the black one?" "He's very dark brown," Levi said, "but in low light he looks black. His name is Roan, which is a funny name for a dark horse, but he was named before I owned him." Rose absorbed this. "Can I see him?" "Rose," Fannie said. "Another time," Levi said to Rose with the careful sincerity that adults rarely directed at 5-year-olds, which Fannie noticed. "I didn't bring him close today, but maybe another time." Rose accepted this with the equanimity of a child who knew a genuine promise from a careless one. She went to find her doll. Levi left before supper, because propriety was what it was and Millhaven had eyes and a long memory. He touched his hat at the door and said he hoped the coffee had been to her satisfaction, and she said it had been excellent. "Thank you." And she watched him ride away again. Only this time she did not pretend to herself that she was looking at the gatepost. He came back the following Saturday with the excuse of dropping off a receipt correction from Gerald Holt for a previous month, which was a thin excuse, and she knew it, and he probably knew she knew it, but she invited him in for coffee again anyway. This became, over the course of April and into May, a kind of pattern that neither of them had formally established, but both were clearly choosing. He would find a reason, sometimes a better reason and sometimes an obvious one, to stop by on a day that was not the first of the month. He fixed the fence post without being asked, on a Tuesday afternoon when she was in the garden, and she did not protest because she had been planning to fix it herself, and it was fixed before she could say anything. He brought Rose a small wooden horse he had carved himself, which was simple and rough-hewn but clearly a horse, unlike Rose's painting, and Rose carried it everywhere for a month. Fannie found herself thinking about him in the evenings after Rose was asleep. She thought about his hands and the careful way he did things, and the way he listened when she spoke, not with the performance of listening that she had learned to recognize in men who were waiting for their turn to talk again, but with the real thing, the quiet attention of someone who was genuinely interested in what she was saying. She thought about Thomas, too, and about grief, and about the complicated question of what a woman was allowed to want when she had buried her husband not yet 2 years ago. She sat with that question honestly, the way she sat with all hard things, and what she found at the bottom of it was that grief and wanting were not opposites. That she could carry Thomas in her memory and still find herself drawn toward the warmth of a living person who had gray eyes and brought eggs and carved horses for her daughter. In May, on a warm evening with the light going gold across the flat land, Levi asked her if she would walk with him, just a walk, down the road and back, while Rose was at Mrs. Alderman's for a supper visit. He asked simply and without embellishment, the way he did everything. She said yes. They walked down the road and back and talked about the spring and the state of the road after the rains, and whether the Barclay Ranch was going to expand its herd this year. And none of it was the conversation they were actually having, which was the quiet one underneath, the one that did not need words, because it was being conducted through the proximity of two people walking together in the last light of a May evening. Their arms occasionally close enough that the air between them felt deliberate. When they came back to her gate, they stopped. "Mrs. Slater," he said. "Fannie," she said. She was not entirely sure why she said it except that she was tired of being Mrs. Slater to him when she had been thinking of him as Levi in her own head for months. Something shifted in his face. "Fannie," he said, and she felt her name in his voice the way you feel the sun on your face when you come out of a dark room. "I would like to see you, properly I mean, not on pretext of fence posts and egg deliveries." She looked at him. "What does properly look like?" she asked. "In practical terms." "Sunday dinner," he said. "If you'd allow it, you and Rose." She thought about this. About Millhaven's eyes and long memory. About what it meant to allow someone to come to Sunday dinner. About what she wanted, which she was beginning to find harder to pretend she did not know. "Sunday dinner," she said. "Yes." He smiled, the real smile, and touched his hat and went, and she stood at her gate and listened to the sound of his horse receding into the warm dark and thought that the world was, for this particular moment, something close to fine. Sunday dinner became a regular occurrence. He came with something from Prute's or from the ranch kitchen, contributed to the meal, ate at her table, talked with her across the clean dishes while Rose played outside with the wooden horse in the last of the afternoon light. It was domestically comfortable in a way that Fannie had not allowed herself to expect, and she found it did not frighten her the way she had thought it might. One Sunday in June, he helped her with the canning she had been putting off, because it was a task that was easier with two pairs of hands. They stood in her kitchen in the thick steam of the canning pot and worked together in an efficient rhythm that they arrived at without discussion. And at one point she turned from the stove and he was right there, closer than she had registered, and they were very near each other in the warm kitchen, and neither of them moved away. "I should not have kept the rent thing from you," he said quietly, "not about the canning, not about anything they had been talking about." "No," she agreed, "you shouldn't have. But I am not sorry that I did it," he said, "only that I didn't tell you." "I know," she said. She looked up at him. The steam was making the air soft and warm between them. "I'm not angry about it any more," she said. "Are you sure?" "I am a woman who knows her own mind, Levi Granger," she said. His eyes did something warm and specific at that. "You are," he said. "It's one of the things I find most remarkable about you." "Most remarkable," she said. "That implies there is a list." "There is a list," he said simply, and she felt her breath do something she did not entirely intend. He kissed her in the kitchen with the canning steam around them and the June light coming through the window, and it was gentle and brief and entirely certain, the way he did things. She pulled back and looked at him. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said. They stood in the kitchen in the warm air, and the moment lasted long enough to become something she would carry with her. And then she turned back to the canning because the jars would not seal themselves, and some things had to be attended to regardless of how the afternoon was developing. He laughed behind her, not unkindly, just with the warm acknowledgement of a man who understood that practical competence and romantic feeling were not mutually exclusive. Summer moved through Millhaven with its particular Texas heat, big and close and relentless, and Fannie and Levi settled into something that was not yet named, but had the weight and solidity of a real thing. He came on Sundays and on some Thursdays. He wrote her a note once, delivered via Prute's store boy, that said only that he hoped the heat was not too hard on the garden, which she read 3 times and kept in the tin box with her money. Rose adored him. She had decided this with the absolute conviction of a 5-year-old who knows what she knows. Somewhere around the second Sunday dinner, when he had sat on the floor and listened seriously to her explanation of the wooden horse's entire biography, which Rose had developed in considerable creative detail. Rose said his name now with the comfortable familiarity of someone who has decided a person belongs in her life, and Fannie watched this and felt something simultaneously tender and careful, the complicated love of a mother who is also allowing herself to want something for herself. There were people in Millhaven who had opinions about it, because Millhaven was the kind of town that had opinions about everything. Fannie was aware of the opinions without giving them much energy. She had made peace with being the widow who managed, and she was quite prepared to be the widow who was being courted by the Barclay Ranch cowboy, and she said so directly to Margaret Alderman one afternoon, when that kind woman had made a careful, gentle comment about what people were saying. What people say and what is true are frequently different things, Fannie said cheerfully, and Margaret Alderman, who had known Fannie long enough to know that this was not a conversation that was going to go in any other direction, agreed that this was certainly so. In September, a year after that first October when Levi had begun paying the difference on her rent, Fannie discovered what had actually been happening in full. She discovered it not through more overheard conversation, but through Rena Holt, Gerald Holt's wife, who was a more perceptive woman than her husband and had, over the course of the summer, developed a cautious, friendly feeling toward Fannie that expressed itself in occasional conversations after church. Rena told her that the payments had started in December, which Fannie already knew. What she had not known was the full extent. Levi had not paid only the $4 difference for 3 months, and then stopped when she found out. He had been paying it for December, January, February, and March, which was 4 months at $4 each, for a total of $16 before Fannie had confronted him in the saloon. $16, $4 a month for 4 months. She sat with this number. She also sat with the fact that he had never mentioned it after she had found out. He had simply agreed to accept repayment if she insisted, and then had never brought it up again. She went to him on a Wednesday evening, which she had never done before, riding out toward the Barclay Ranch on the horse she borrowed occasionally from Mrs. Alderman. She found him near the fence line on the east side of the property, working on a stretch of wire with another hand, who took one look at the expression on Fannie Slater's face and found very urgent business elsewhere. "Fannie," he said, surprised. $16, she said. He straightened. "Ah," he said, 4 months. "Yes." She sat on Mrs. Alderman's horse and looked down at him in the September evening light. "Why didn't you tell me the full amount when I confronted you? You let me think it was only the last month." "You were already upset," he said, "and it seemed like adding to the number would not help anything." "That was not your decision to make," she said, for the second time in the history of their knowing each other. He put down the wire tool. He looked up at her with an expression that was not defensive but was honestly contrite, the way he was when he was wrong and knew it. "You're right," he said. "I should have told you the full amount. I'm sorry." She looked at him. Her irritation was real, but it was also doing that thing it always did with this man, the thing where it got softer at the edges faster than she wanted it to. "I am going to need considerably longer to pay you back $16, she said. "Fannie," he said gently. $16, she said firmly. "All right," he said, with the particular capitulation of a man who knows when the woman he loves has made up her mind. The word registered, even though she had not said it and he had not said it, but it was in the space between them now, the word that her brain had produced without permission, and she felt it settle into place like the last piece of a puzzle that had been sitting face down on the table. She rode back to Millhaven in the early dark and thought about love, which she had not thought about in practical terms for a long time. In October, exactly 1 year after the story had begun on her front porch with a man who held his hat in his hands and a look of carefully carried weight, Levi Granger came to her door on a Sunday afternoon when the light was the same particular gold it had been that first October. Rose was at Mrs. Alderman's. He knocked 3 firm taps. She opened the door. He was standing there with his hat in his hands, and he said, "Fannie." "Come in," she said. He came in. He stood in her kitchen, which was the room where most of their important things had happened, and he said, "I have been wanting to ask you something for several months." "I know," she said. He blinked. "You know." "You have been working up to it since June," she said. "I am not impatient, but I thought you should know that I am aware of what you've been building toward, so you need not feel that the question will be unexpected." He stared at her for a moment, and then a laugh moved through him, warm and genuine. "You see everything," he said. "I do," she agreed. He turned his hat brim twice. "Will you marry me?" he said. "I have saved. There is not a great deal, but there is something, and I want to find land, something small, something we could build on. I want to be Rose's father if she'll have me. I want to be your husband." He stopped. "I love you," he said. "I think I have loved you since I watched you tell me without saying a word that you were perfectly capable of managing without anyone's help, and I thought yes, but perhaps you shouldn't have to." Fannie looked at him. She thought about the tin box on the second shelf and the nights by lamplight and the careful arithmetic of survival. She thought about steam and canning jars and a note about her garden that she had read 3 times. She thought about a man who carved wooden horses and listened to 5-year-olds describe imaginary biographies and fixed fence posts without making her feel incapable. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, and he held her face in his calloused, capable hands, and he kissed her with the same certainty as June, but with more of it, more warmth and more honesty, and the weight of everything that had accumulated between them over a year of front doors and coffee, and the complicated, beautiful arithmetic of 2 people choosing each other. They were married in December of 1879 in Millhaven's church with the crooked steeple, on a cold, bright day when the sun came off the flat land with an almost reflective quality, sharp and clear. Margaret Alderman stood with Fannie and Horace Prout stood with Levi, which was an unlikely combination but a genuine one, because Prout, for all his tobacco smell, was at heart a sentimental man, and had been following the entire story of Fannie Slater and Levi Granger from his side of the shelf for well over a year. Rose served as flower girl with a focused seriousness that she gave to all important tasks. She wore a dress that Fannie had made from blue cotton, the same blue cotton from the bolt at Prout's store near which she had stood and overheard the conversation that had changed everything, which felt like the right kind of symbolic circle. Gerald Holt attended because Millhaven was small and he had been invited, and it would have been rude not to. He sat in the 3rd pew looking slightly confused about how he had become a peripheral character in a love story that he had unwittingly helped create by raising a widow's rent. Rena Holt sat beside him and cried a little during the vows, which she maintained afterward was purely because the church was cold. Levi said his vows with the same directness he brought to everything, looking at Fannie without looking anywhere else, saying the words as though he had thought about each of them and found them all accurate. Fannie said hers in a clear voice that did not waver, because she was a woman who meant what she said and had known for some months exactly what she meant when she said this. They moved into a new place after the wedding because the Barclay Ranch had offered Levi a foreman position, which came with an increase in wages and a small house on the property that was rough but solid. Fannie made the house into a home with the efficiency and creativity that had served her well in the rented house in town, and within 3 months it looked like a place that had been loved for years. She had started repaying him the $16 in careful installments from her mending money, which he accepted because he had learned that this was important to her, and he respected what was important to her. By the time they were married, she had repaid 11 of the 16, and on their wedding night she pressed $5 into his hand and said that completed the debt. He held the $5 and looked at her. "The debt is settled," she said. "It was never really a debt," he said. "It was to me," she said, "and now it's settled, and that's the end of it." He put the $5 on the dresser and kissed her and said all right, and it was the end of it, all except for the warmth of the knowing that each of them carried, that he had given her something freely, and she had given it back with interest by giving him something worth far more, and neither of them needed to say that aloud because they were people who understood each other without saying everything. The Barclay Ranch went through a difficult period in the spring of 1880, as the cattle market shifted in ways that affected operations across the region. This was the reality of living in the West in this era, the boom and the fragility running always alongside each other, and Levi navigated the changes with the steady competence that had made him valuable to the ranch. He took on additional responsibilities, proved himself indispensable, and by the following year was one of the most trusted men on the Barclay payroll. He had not given up the idea of land of his own. He simply set the saving aside again and began again, this time with Fannie's mending income and her careful management of their household finances, making the savings grow faster than they had when he was saving alone. Rose turned 6 that spring and 7 that fall, and seemed to sail through time with the effortless speed of children, learning her letters and numbers with the same serious focus she brought to everything, calling Levi Papa, by her own decision somewhere in the spring of 1880, a day when she simply started doing it and never stopped. Levi had been in the barn when she first said it, and when Fannie found him later he was working on a piece of tack with the particular excessive focus of a man who is managing a large feeling by directing it toward a physical task. "She called you Papa," Fannie said. "She did," he said, his voice a little rough around the edges. "Are you all right?" "I'm the best I have ever been," he said, and kept his eyes on the tack. She put her hand on his arm and stood with him in the barn for a while, and they did not need to say anything else. In the autumn of 1880, Fannie told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, which was where their important things happened, sitting across from him at the table after supper with her hands flat on the surface the way she put them when she was saying something important. He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said because that was the man he was. "I am very well," she said. He came around the table and held her carefully in the kitchen with the lamp burning low, and she felt the warmth of him against her and thought about the first time she had seen him on her porch with his hat in his hands and how thoroughly wrong she had been about the shape of what was coming. The baby was born in the spring of 1881. A boy they named Thomas James Granger, the Thomas for Fannie's first husband whose memory she honored, and the James for Levi's father who had died when Levi was young. The baby arrived with the gusty, opinionated quality of an infant who has decided immediately that the world is interesting, and he intends to examine all of it. Rose took to her brother with a proprietary intensity, standing over his basket and explaining things to him at length about the world, which he received with the serene indifference of a newborn, but which Rose considered worthwhile nonetheless. Levi held his son in the early morning light of their bedroom on the day after the birth, while Fannie slept in the exhausted deep sleep of a woman who has done an enormous amount of work, and he stood by the window with this small weight in his arms and looked out at the flat Texas land going gold and green in the spring sun, and felt a fullness in his chest that he had no adequate word for and did not need one. Millhaven grew a little over those years, as towns do. A new doctor arrived, younger and better trained than the one who had failed to save Thomas Slater and had since retired. A school was established, a real one with a dedicated teacher, which meant Rose graduated from Mrs. Alderman's letters to a proper classroom where she sat in the front row and had opinions about everything the teacher said, some of them correct. Gerald Holt sold 2 of his rental properties and retired to a somewhat smaller house after a business arrangement that did not work out the way he had planned, which Fannie heard about from Rena without any particular emotion, except a mild sense that the universe occasionally managed its own small adjustments. In 1882, Levi found the land. It was 20 acres 3 miles west of Millhaven, flat and well-watered from a creek that ran along the southern edge, with a small house on it that needed more than it did not need but was structurally sound. The man selling it was a rancher who was moving north and needed a quick sale, which meant the price was reasonable, and Levi's savings had been building for 2 years with Fannie's careful management. He told her about it on a Sunday evening after the children were in bed. He spread the surveyor's description on the kitchen table and showed her the boundaries and the water access and the state of the house as best he could describe it, and then he waited. She studied the paper. Then she looked up at him. "Have you walked the land?" "3 times," he said. "The creek runs good. The soil is reasonable. The house needs work, but the bones of it are solid." "How much work?" "A new roof on the east side, new chimney flashing, the floor in the kitchen needs to come up and be reset, and 2 of the windows want replacing. None of it is beyond what we can do in stages." She looked at the paper again. "How much is he asking?" he told her. She ran the numbers in her head, which took about 30 seconds. "We can do this," she said, "if we're careful with it for the first 2 seasons." "We're always careful," he said. "We are," she agreed, with a smile that was both affectionate and accurate. They bought the land in March of 1882 and moved to it in May when the weather had warmed enough to make the work on the house possible. Levi and 2 ranch hands from Barclay spent 3 Saturdays fixing the roof and chimney, while Fannie supervised the kitchen floor with the same focused competence she brought to everything. Rose helped by carrying tools and fetching water and providing commentary on the progress. And Thomas, now 13 months old and fully mobile, helped by attempting to put every nail he found into his mouth. By June the house was livable, and by August it was home, which is a different thing, and Fannie stood in the kitchen of their own house, their own, with the garden visible through the window and the creek glinting in the summer light in the distance, and felt the satisfaction of a woman who has built something real. She thought about that first kitchen, the rented one in Millhaven, and the tin box on the second shelf, and the receipt that said $12 when she had paid $8, and the specific quality of the morning she had found out. She thought about all the distance between that morning and this one. Levi came in from checking the fence line and found her standing at the window and came to stand beside her, following her gaze out across the land. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About how strange it is," she said, "the way things arrange themselves." "Strange how? I thought you were collecting rent," she said. "You were paying it. I thought I knew what was happening. I was entirely wrong." "You weren't wrong about what was happening," he said. "You just didn't know all of it." She looked at him. "Do you know what the best part of finding out was?" "What?" "Not the fact that you'd paid it," she said. "That made me furious, at least for a while. The best part was understanding why. That there was a man in the world who had seen me and thought she should not have to carry all of this alone, and done something about it quietly, without asking for anything in return." "I got considerably more than I expected in return," he said, with the warmth that still moved through his voice when he talked about them, about this life, with a gratitude that had not faded with familiarity. "We both did," she said. He put his arm around her in the kitchen of their own house on their own land in the summer of 1882, and they stood at the window and looked out at what they had made. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the kind of abundance that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with the particular grace of finding the person with whom ordinary life becomes something worth examining carefully. The following years moved with the full weight and texture of real living, not without difficulty, because nothing real is without it, but with the particular quality that comes from doing hard things alongside the right person. The winter of 1882 was one of the hardest on the Texas plains in recent memory, the kind of cold that came down from the north with a ferocity that surprised even the ranchers who had been watching winters for decades. Levi worked from before first light until well into the dark every day for 3 weeks straight, keeping the cattle alive and the fences intact and making sure the family had fuel and water. Fannie kept the house, managed the children, kept the animals that were her responsibility fed and sheltered, and cooked meals for the ranch hands who were working alongside her husband in a kind of quiet, organized generosity that she did not announce because it did not occur to her to announce it. At the end of those 3 weeks, when the cold broke and the first signs of relenting appeared in the sky, Levi came inside and stood in the kitchen door still wearing his coat, and Fannie looked at him with the particular look she had, the one that saw everything. "Sit down," she said, and put food in front of him and sat across from him, and they ate together in the warm kitchen while the children slept. And when he looked up and met her eyes, she thought that this was what she had not known to want until she had it, this specific irreplaceable thing. Rose turned 8 in 1883 and showed every sign of being the most opinionated person in any room she entered, which Fannie observed with secret pride. She was sharp and curious and stubborn, in a way that was already being described by her teacher as strong-willed, which both Levi and Fannie understood to be a quality that would serve her well if pointed in productive directions. Thomas was 2 and then 3, relentlessly physical, interested in everything that moved or could be made to move, following his father around the farm with the absolute conviction of a small boy who has decided that whatever his father does is the most important activity currently occurring on Earth. In the spring of 1883, Fannie told Levi she was expecting again. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and looked at her with those gray eyes that still, after everything, did the warm, specific thing when they looked at her. "Are you well?" he said, first, always first. "Very well," she said. He reached across the table and took her hands in his and held them. "A good thing," she said. "The best of things," he said. The second baby came in December of 1883, a girl this time, with Levi's gray eyes and Fannie's dark hair, and a temperament so calm and serene that Rose found her initial disappointment at not having another sibling as opinionated as herself gradually replaced by a fascinated affection for this small person who seemed to find everything in the world entirely acceptable. They named her Clara Jane Granger. Jane for Fannie's mother, who was in Boston, whom Fannie had written to regularly since arriving in Texas, and whom she hoped one day to see again, though the distance was great. Clara for no one in particular except that it sounded right. It sounded like the clear, bright thing this child was. Millhaven in 1884 was not the same Millhaven it had been in 1878. There was a new railway spur being discussed, which would change everything about the town's position in the region. There was a proper school now and a proper doctor, and a third saloon that had been built in the optimistic belief that Millhaven's growth would continue, which it seemed likely to do. The land around the town was being worked by more families each year, people coming west with the same determination that had brought Levi from Tennessee and Fannie from Boston, each of them looking for the thing that was still being made. Levi had by now left the Barclay Ranch's employ, though he maintained a good relationship with the Barclays and did occasional contract work for them during their busy seasons. He worked his own 20 acres and had added to it by another 10 through a neighboring sale in 1883, and the operation, while modest, was steadily productive. He was known in Millhaven and in the wider community as a reliable and honest man, which in the economy of the frontier was as valuable as any currency. Fannie had not given up her sewing. She had expanded it, in fact, now that she had more space and slightly more time, into a small but genuine business. She made clothing to order for families in Millhaven and on the surrounding ranches, and the quality of her work was well known. She had a particular skill with alteration and the ability to look at a piece of fabric and see what it wanted to become, which was a skill she had always had and had now simply been given room to exercise fully. One evening in the summer of 1884, she sat at her sewing table by the window with the last light of the day falling across her work, and Levi came in from the south field and stopped in the doorway and watched her for a moment before she knew he was there. He had a habit of doing this, of pausing to look at her when she was occupied with something else, as though the sight of her going about the ordinary business of her life still surprised him with its beauty. She looked up and caught him watching. "How long have you been standing there?" "Not long," he said. "You look like you're thinking something," she said. He came into the room and sat on the edge of the chair nearest her. "I was thinking," he said, "about what this looked like from the outside. 6 years ago, I mean, what someone riding past would have seen." "A widow in a rented house in a small town," she said. "Yes," he said, "and what they would see now." She looked around the room, the house they owned, The sounds of their children from the back of the house, Rose's voice carrying over Thomas's rumble and Clara's quieter presence underneath both. The garden through the window. The 20 acres of their own land going amber in the late sun. They would see a woman who managed, she said, which is what I always intended. They would see a woman who built something remarkable, he said. She looked at him. We built it, she said. You had the bones of it already, he said. You paid the difference, she said softly. That is what you did. You have always paid the difference. He looked at her for a long moment. So have you, he said. She put down her sewing and reached across and took his hand, and they sat in the evening light of their own house on their own land, and the children moved through the sounds of the back rooms, and the Texas evening came down gold and wide and full over the flat land outside the window, and everything was closed and completed and whole. The debt had been repaid, every dollar. The rent had been settled, and then the house that required it left behind for something better. The loneliness of a widow managing alone had been replaced by the specific full-hearted noise of a family that had been made from choice and difficulty, and the quiet radical act of one man who had seen someone struggling and had simply, without announcement, decided to help. Gerald Holt drove past the Granger property on his way to his sister's house in 1885 and slowed his wagon at the sight of it. The neat fencing and the expanded house and the garden that ran along the whole south side. And he was not quite smart enough to understand how his small act of greed in raising a widow's rent had set in motion a chain of events that led directly to this. But Rena Holt, sitting beside him, understood it completely and smiled out at the property as they drove past. Rose Slater, as she continued to call herself though she loved Levi entirely, graduated from the Millhaven school at 14, with the best marks of any student that year. She informed her parents that she intended to become a teacher herself, which neither of them doubted for a single moment. Thomas Granger, at 7, was everything a boy on a working ranch could be, capable and rough and tumble and deeply loyal to his father, following him through the work of the land with a competence that was already remarkable for his age. Clara Granger remained calm and bright, and grew into a small person of unexpected humor, who said very little but said it precisely, which was a quality that made both her parents look at each other sometimes across the table, with the particular look of parents who recognize something of themselves in a child and feel the complicated warmth of it. Fannie Granger, in the evening of 1885, sat in her own kitchen in her own house and thought about the full arc of things. From the tin box on the second shelf to this table that she owned. From $8 handed to a man she barely knew to the understanding that it had never quite been what she thought it was. From the woman who said, "I will manage," alone in the dark to the woman who managed alongside someone else, which she had learned was not a lesser kind of strength but a different kind, and in many ways the harder kind because it required the courage to let someone see you as you were. She had been seen. From the beginning, she had been seen by a man who held his hat in his hands and had gray eyes and a habit of paying the difference. She would not trade any of it. Not the hard years before him, or the complicated first months of knowing him, or the conversation in the saloon, where she'd looked him in the eye and asked why, and received an honest answer. Not the canning steam or the walking in the May evening or the cold winter that nearly bent them and did not. Not the births or the seasons or the ordinary suppers at the ordinary table that were, she had come to understand, not ordinary at all. Levi came in from evening chores and found her at the table with a cup of coffee and the particular expression that meant she had been thinking deeply, and he sat down across from her and poured himself a cup from the pot on the stove and looked at her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She smiled across the table at him. At the gray eyes and the strong hands and the man who had once quietly paid her rent and in doing so had paid something else, something she could not name but had been carrying the value of ever since. "About how wrong I was," she said, "that first morning." "About what?" he said. "About what was happening at my front door," she said. He looked at her. "I thought you were collecting something from me," she said. but you were bringing something right from the start." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "So were you," he said, "right from the start." Outside the window, the Texas evening came down full and wide, and the land went deep gold in the last light. And inside the house, their children moved through the warm rooms, and the coffee was good, and the table was solid, and everything that needed to be resolved had been resolved, and everything that needed to be built had been built. And Fanny Granger looked at her husband across the table and thought that the world was, in this particular moment, exactly and entirely enough.